Most men think betrayal happens because they miss some giant red flag. They imagine cheating always looks obvious, dramatic, and easy to catch. But the truth is far more dangerous than that. Most men who get blindsided were not weak, stupid, or incapable. They were simply trained to pay attention to the wrong things. They were taught to look for hidden phones, secret passwords, and late-night disappearances, while ignoring the quiet behavioral shifts that actually expose what is happening beneath the surface. That is exactly why so many men stay in relationships long after the emotional connection has already been given to somebody else. Everything still looks normal on the outside, so they keep convincing themselves that their instincts must be wrong. A woman can still smile at you, sleep beside you, post pictures with you, and still mentally be halfway out the door. That is the part most men fail to understand until the damage has already been done. This is why learning how to observe behavior before emotional attachment matters so much. Once feelings become involved, logic becomes weaker. Men start explaining away things they would normally question. They begin defending situations that should make them uncomfortable because they want peace more than truth. Today, we are breaking down the patterns many men overlook before betrayal fully reveals itself. These are not random incidents. These are repeated behavioral habits that show up over and over again in failing relationships. Once you understand them, you stop viewing attraction, loyalty, and emotional investment the same way ever again. The first pattern most men completely misread is sudden emotional warmth. Ironically, this is the one that feels the best, which is exactly why it becomes so dangerous. A lot of men believe cheating always creates distance, coldness, and hostility. Sometimes it does. But many times, guilt creates the opposite reaction. Suddenly she becomes softer, more affectionate, more attentive, and more emotionally available than she has been in months. At first, it feels like the relationship is finally healing. She starts hugging you longer, texting you more often, checking on you during the day, and showing physical affection that had slowly disappeared before. Naturally, your guard drops because every man wants to feel loved and chosen. You start believing the difficult phase is finally over. The tension that used to exist begins fading, and you convince yourself that your earlier concerns were simply overthinking. But this is where many men stop observing behavior carefully. Sudden warmth without a clear emotional rebuilding process should always make you slow down and pay attention. Real emotional repair usually happens gradually through communication, consistency, accountability, and effort over time. It does not normally appear overnight like a switch being flipped. A lot of women use affection as emotional insurance. Deep down, she understands that when a man feels emotionally safe, he becomes less alert. He stops questioning inconsistencies because the affection comforts him psychologically. Instead of examining behavior objectively, he starts protecting the relationship emotionally. That is how months and even years get wasted. A man stays attached to the feeling of being loved while ignoring the uncomfortable truth happening quietly underneath the surface. The second pattern many men miss is the normalization of another man's presence. This is one of the smartest ways emotional cheating begins because nothing initially looks threatening. She introduces him casually, almost strategically, so your brain automatically places him in the category of harmless background characters. Maybe he is a coworker, a gym friend, an old classmate, or somebody she suddenly mentions more often during normal conversations. At first, you do not think much about it because his name appears in ordinary situations. She talks about how funny he is, how helpful he was at work, or how he understands certain things she deals with. Over time, his presence becomes familiar to you, and familiarity lowers resistance. That is the entire point. Most men avoid questioning this because they do not want to look insecure, possessive, or controlling. So instead of paying attention to the emotional closeness developing, they start defending the situation themselves. They convince themselves they are simply being mature and trusting. Meanwhile, emotional boundaries are slowly disappearing right in front of them. The dangerous part is that emotional attachment rarely begins physically. It begins through attention, emotional comfort, inside jokes, shared conversations, and repeated communication. Attraction grows wherever emotional energy is consistently invested. Once another man becomes the person she feels understood by, your position in the relationship quietly weakens without obvious conflict ever happening. This is why emotional priorities matter more than labels. A man does not become dangerous because of his title. He becomes dangerous because of the emotional access he gains over time. If you ignore those subtle shifts early, you may eventually realize another man has already occupied the emotional space that once belonged to you. The third pattern most men completely misunderstand is consistency being used as a cover. A lot of guys expect cheating to completely disrupt routines. They think suspicious behavior always looks chaotic, reckless, or obvious. But experienced deception usually looks controlled. The schedule stays mostly the same, the habits remain familiar, and daily life continues appearing normal on the surface. That is exactly why it becomes difficult to detect. She still goes to the gym at the same time. She still has girls' nights. She still leaves for work the same way she always has. Nothing dramatic changes externally, which causes you to question your own instincts whenever something feels slightly off. But what many men fail to notice are the small shifts happening inside those routines. Maybe she suddenly spends much longer getting ready for simple outings that never required that level of effort before. Maybe she comes home emotionally disconnected, even though her schedule technically stayed unchanged. Maybe the explanations make sense individually, but together they quietly create confusion you cannot fully explain. This is where intuition begins fighting logic. Your mind keeps searching for concrete proof because nothing looks serious enough to confront directly. So you start suppressing your discomfort and convincing yourself you are imagining things. Over time, this creates mental exhaustion because your eyes notice inconsistencies while your emotions keep trying to dismiss them. Women who hide things successfully rarely make careless mistakes. They understand that obvious disruptions create suspicion. Instead, they hide changes inside familiar patterns because familiar behavior lowers attention. That is why many men lose trust in their own perception during these situations. The surface remains calm, while the meaning behind certain behaviors quietly changes underneath. And when a man stops trusting his own observations, confusion starts controlling the relationship instead of clarity. The fourth pattern many men fall into is having their suspicion turned back against them. This is where the psychological manipulation becomes extremely dangerous because the focus quietly shifts away from her behavior and onto your reaction. The moment you start noticing inconsistencies, tension, or emotional distance, she immediately changes the frame of the conversation. Instead of explaining the behavior that caused concern, she begins questioning your mindset, your trust, or your emotional stability. You may ask something simple and reasonable, but suddenly you are being treated like the problem. She says you are overthinking, acting insecure, being paranoid, or creating unnecessary drama. And because most men genuinely want to be fair and reasonable, they start second-guessing themselves almost immediately. This is how emotional confusion replaces observation. Instead of calmly evaluating patterns, you begin defending your intentions. You start apologizing for asking questions that made perfect sense in the first place. Some men even overcompensate afterward by becoming extra loving, buying gifts, planning dates, or trying harder emotionally because they feel guilty for creating tension. That is exactly where many relationships become psychologically unbalanced. The man slowly transitions from observing behavior to seeking reassurance. He becomes focused on restoring peace instead of discovering truth. Meanwhile, the original issue quietly disappears without ever being addressed properly. The danger here is not just betrayal itself. The real damage is losing confidence in your own judgment. Once a man becomes emotionally trained to ignore his instincts, he becomes easier to manipulate repeatedly. Over time, he stops trusting what he sees and starts relying completely on how she frames reality for him. And when that happens, emotional leadership inside the relationship completely collapses. The fifth pattern many men overlook is when her social presence starts looking unusually clean and perfectly managed. Most guys assume that if a woman is hiding something, she will become secretive online or suddenly disappear from social media completely. But many times the opposite happens. Her public image actually becomes more polished, more stable, and more convincing than before. She posts happy pictures together, leaves supportive comments, and creates an online appearance that makes the relationship seem completely secure. From the outside, everything looks healthy and strong. Friends, family, and even you begin believing things must be fine because the public image feels reassuring. But appearances can easily become part of the cover. A lot of men make the mistake of treating social media validation like proof of loyalty. They think, If she was doing something wrong, she would not post me publicly. But public presentation and private behavior are two completely different worlds. Sometimes those posts exist specifically to reduce suspicion and maintain control over how the relationship is perceived. Meanwhile, the real emotional activity happens privately through disappearing messages, hidden conversations, emotional attachments, and communication channels you never see. The cleaner the public image becomes, the less likely people are to question what is happening behind the scenes. This creates a dangerous psychological trap for men, because the relationship begins looking more stable publicly than it actually feels privately. Deep down, you may still sense emotional distance or inconsistency, but the public image pressures you into ignoring those feelings. Nobody wants to believe they are being betrayed, while the relationship appears perfect to everyone else. That is why many men end up becoming the last person to recognize the relationship emotionally ended long before the truth finally surfaced. The sixth pattern many men feel but struggle to explain is emotional energy being redirected somewhere else. Before physical cheating ever happens, emotional investment usually shifts first. This is why many men notice the change long before they can actually prove anything. The conversations feel different, the connection loses depth, and her presence starts feeling incomplete, even when she is physically beside you. You begin noticing that she no longer engages with the same level of emotional attention. When you talk about your day, her responses become shorter and less interested. The little curiosity she once had about your thoughts, goals, or feelings slowly disappears. Instead of feeling emotionally connected, you start feeling tolerated. This is one of the most painful stages because the relationship technically still exists, but emotionally, something already feels missing. You may still spend time together, sleep in the same bed, and maintain the same routines, but internally you feel like you are no longer the center of her emotional world. Attraction naturally follows emotional investment. Wherever attention, understanding, excitement, and emotional comfort are consistently flowing, attachment begins growing. If another man becomes the person she confides in emotionally, the connection between you and her starts weakening quietly in the background. Many men respond to this by trying harder. They become more available, more patient, and more emotionally invested, hoping the connection will return if they put in enough effort. But emotional withdrawal cannot be repaired through desperation. In many situations, the harder a man chases the old connection, the more emotionally exhausted he becomes. Eventually, he realizes he has been fighting to hold on to someone who emotionally left long before the relationship officially ended. The seventh pattern many men completely misjudge is when a woman uses her identity and reputation as a shield. Some women build an image around being loyal, honest, innocent, and morally trustworthy. They speak constantly about values, integrity, and the type of behavior they claim they would never tolerate. Over time, that image becomes so strong that men stop paying attention to actual behavior because the reputation itself creates emotional comfort. This is where many guys become vulnerable. Instead of observing actions consistently, they begin trusting the character she verbally presents to the world. They assume someone who speaks confidently about loyalty must automatically practice it behind closed doors. But words alone never prove integrity. Patterns do. A woman can repeatedly talk about being different from other women while quietly violating the same standards she publicly praises. The image becomes more important than the truth itself. As long as she continues appearing innocent, she feels protected psychologically. That is why some people can betray others while still convincing themselves they are fundamentally good individuals. Many men ignore obvious inconsistencies because they are emotionally attached to the version of her they believed existed. They continue defending her character long after the behavior stopped matching the image she created. Hope replaces observation, and emotional attachment blinds them to reality. This becomes dangerous because false identities create false trust. A man who cannot separate words from patterns will continue giving loyalty to people who have already emotionally abandoned him. Real character is revealed through consistent actions when nobody is watching, not through speeches about morality, loyalty, or good intentions. One of the biggest mistakes men make in relationships is waiting until betrayal becomes obvious before they start paying attention. By the time cheating fully reveals itself, the emotional damage has usually been building for months underneath the surface. The warning signs were there, but they were ignored, explained away, or emotionally softened because the man wanted the relationship to work more than he wanted to face uncomfortable truths. This is why observation matters more than emotion when it comes to protecting your peace and your future. Feelings can be manipulated, affection can be timed strategically, reassurance can be used to calm your instincts, but behavior repeated consistently over time always tells the real story. Patterns reveal what emotions try to hide. A lot of men stay trapped because they believe love alone should be enough to keep someone loyal. But loyalty is not built through love alone. It is built through discipline, boundaries, emotional maturity, honesty, and respect. Without those things, attraction can easily drift toward whoever provides emotional excitement or validation in the moment. The strongest men are not the ones constantly living in fear or suspicion. The strongest men are the ones capable of observing reality clearly without letting emotions distort their judgment. They do not panic when something feels off, but they also do not silence their instincts just to avoid conflict. When a man learns how to recognize behavioral shifts early, he stops becoming emotionally dependent on explanations and empty reassurance. He starts trusting patterns instead of promises. And that shift alone changes the type of women he allows into his life, because he no longer ignores the things that once destroyed his peace quietly over time. At the end of the day, most men are not destroyed by betrayal itself. They are destroyed by the confusion, self-doubt, and emotional blindness that came before it. The hardest part is not always losing the relationship. The hardest part is realizing you ignored your instincts for months while trying to convince yourself everything was okay. That internal battle slowly drains confidence from a man until he no longer trusts his own judgment. This is why understanding behavioral patterns matters so much. The goal is not to become paranoid, bitter, or emotionally closed off. The goal is to develop enough awareness to recognize when somebody's actions stop aligning with their words. Healthy relationships should create clarity, consistency, emotional safety, and mutual effort. They should not leave you constantly questioning yourself while trying to hold on to disappearing energy. A man who learns from these situations becomes harder to manipulate emotionally because he no longer ignores discomfort simply to maintain temporary peace. He understands that loyalty is revealed through behavior over time, not through promises, social media appearances, or emotional speeches. That awareness protects his future, his confidence, and his emotional stability. The truth is, the right woman will never require you to abandon your instincts in order to love her. Real loyalty brings peace, not confusion. Real connection strengthens trust instead of forcing you to constantly silence your intuition. If you made it this far, make sure you subscribe to the channel and stay connected for more videos like this. And remember this moving forward: never ignore repeated patterns just because you are emotionally attached to the person showing them.